So I watched Spider-Man Miles Morales. Yes, you heard that right. I watched it. I did not play it. I've never really been able to get a PS4, and I definitely cannot afford to get a PS5. So I elected to watch a cutscene, like movie version of it on YouTube. So I guess definitely keep that in mind. I did not experience it the way that it's meant to be experienced. I'm pretty sure there's like a bunch of like Easter egg sort of stuff that sort of help flesh out the story and flesh out the sort of background behind a lot of the characters. Like, like when you're walking around an environment and it'll be like, press triangle, and then Miles is like, I remember back in the day when me and my dad played catch in the park, stuff like that. There's a lot of that stuff that I probably didn't get to experience. But I don't know, just keep that in mind when I talk about it. But yeah, I watched this cutscene movie version of it. It was around 2.5 hours, and it worked like a really solid Spider-Man movie. I really enjoyed it. I don't think I enjoyed the story quite as much as Spider-Man PS4, but then again, like, Spider-Man PS4 is one of my favorite Spider-Man stories of all time. I think it might be the best one. I don't know. It's definitely up there with Into the Spider-Verse, but Spider-Man Miles Morales is still really solid. So yeah, it follows Miles Morales. It's like pretty much I think I read somewhere that it takes place, I think maybe a year or 6 months after the ending of the first game. I'm not entirely sure, but at this point in the story, Miles, he is like an active Spider-Man, right? He's going out with Peter on sort of missions and stuff. He's Spider-Manning, so it's not really like his origins necessarily. I think it's kind of more akin to that the Batman movie that's coming out, directed by Matt Reeves, to where he's been Spider-Man for a bit. But he's still obviously pretty inexperienced, so this game is kind of about him coming into his own, I would say. And from that perspective, I will say, I think maybe my biggest criticism, it's not even really a criticism, is that there are just a lot of stuff that I think they took inspiration from Into the Spider-Verse. Just a lot of thematic elements, with Miles sort of like finding himself, even though Into the Spider-Verse was definitely definitely was an origin story. Even then, that sort of thematic element is very much, it's very much sort of taken from Into the Spider-Verse. Just a lot of the stuff with with like the music, them having like sort of like hip hop music in the thing. Just a lot of the way that like Miles is like walking around with like headphones. It's just a lot of thematic and sort of stylistic elements that I feel like they took from Into the Spider-Verse. But even then, I don't know that that's necessarily a criticism. I don't know, because that stuff, it still worked for me and it didn't bother me. So it's not even really a criticism. It's just something that I noticed. And also, you know what? If Peter can have 8 million different movies that are kind of samey, I think we'll survive if Miles has a movie and a video game that feel kind of similar. But yeah, I think where that stuff maybe takes away from the experience is that there are a lot of stuff in the game to where if you saw Into the Spider-Verse, you'll kind of be able to guess sort of how certain relationships are going to play out, certain motivation, not necessarily motivations, but just what certain characters, you'll know who they are, and you're gonna kind of know what they're gonna do. I don't know, it's hard to talk about it without spoiling it, but yeah, it feels familiar to Into the Spider-Verse. But yeah, the thing about is that it's still a really solid story. There's a lot of heart to it. I just I like saying Puerto Rican culture like highlighted in a high profile game like this, because I'm Puerto Rican, and in Into the Spider-Verse there wasn't that much Puerto Rican sort of culture highlighted in that movie, but in the Miles Morales game, they definitely highlighted a bit more. Like, hey, listen, I saw like pastelillos, or no, sorry, not pastelillos, pasteles being served in a in a AAA game, for Christmas dinner. It's like just that on its own was really cool to see. And yeah, from that perspective, it was just really cool. And just seeing, I think the Insomniac games, they're very good about really highlighting the interpersonal dynamics between the characters. I think maybe some people say that that's sort of a fault of like the MCU Spider-Man movies, to where they're not necessarily as emotional as the Raimi movies. I don't necessarily agree with Homecoming. I definitely agree with that criticism as far as Far From Home, but I think the Insomniacs are definitely more in the vein of the Raimi movies, to where they really highlight the really personal dynamics between the Miles and his friends and family, and like Miles and the villains. It's very personal. It's a very personal story. The story is very small scale, actually. Well, I mean, smaller scale than the first game. Like it's like I guess like in in Spider-Man PS4, it's like it felt like kind of a larger area was sort of being affected by what the villain was doing. In this game, it's sort of, I think it's like a city block that'll be affected. But yeah, I guess overall, this story feels a bit smaller in terms of just the dynamics between the characters. I guess not. I don't know if that really made sense, but I think the scope of the story feels a bit smaller, and as well as the length of the story was definitely smaller. Yes, but I don't necessarily think that that's a detriment to the story necessarily. I think Insomniac did a good job of, telling it in a concise manner. Like, I don't necessarily think that the length of the story was a detriment to it. I think they handled it pretty well, because that is actually one of the things that I was worried about going into it, because the Spider-Man PS4 DLCs like weren't all that great. They kind of felt, they felt kind of half-assed. So I was kind of worried going into this one. I'm like, is this gonna feel like the DLCs, or are they actually gonna like make this its own proper thing? And they definitely did make this its own proper thing. Like, even though yes, it is smaller, this doesn't feel like less important. It's not like it's no less of a game, I would say, than Spider-Man PS4. At least from a story perspective. I can't speak to it from a gameplay perspective. But yeah, I don't know. Those are just kind of me rambling and talking about the game. I personally really enjoyed it. I don't think it's quite as good as Spider-Man PS4, but even then, it's still a pretty great game, or a story. You know what I mean. But yeah, what do you think about it? Did you play it? Did you watch it like me? Did you enjoy it? Did you hate it? Let me know in the comments below. Subscribe, ring the bell, and goodbye.